Welcome back. In this set of video lectures, I'm going to be talking about Jeremy Bentham. Bentham was British, lived in the 1700s and early 1800s, so thousands of years after Aristotle and Confucius. But he's important for us because he's the founder of a really original idea in ethical theory that has been very influential ever since. This is now known as the utilitarian tradition. We'll see more about what defines the utilitarian tradition very soon. Another point about Bentham that's worth noting is that in the time that he was writing, he was considered a radical of sorts. He was involved in pushing for a number of political reforms in Great Britain at the time, and more widely the world. But some of his issues that he wrote about and advocated in regard to involved punishment, like criminal punishment, criminal justice might be called today, but policies around punishment, imprisonment, the death penalty, and so on. Also slavery, which of course was a phenomenon in Great Britain and also in North and South America at the time. Women's rights. At this time, women did not widely have the right to vote, and there were a number of other ways in which their rights were not equal to those of men. Homosexuality and the treatment of animals. So as we talk about Bentham's philosophy, as I sort of talk through the main points of it in these video lectures, and as you read Bentham, or after you read the pages of Bentham that are assigned for this week, you can ask, what do I think Bentham would say about each of these topics? And we'll come back to this question at the end of going over the basics of Bentham's ethical theory. So the text that we've read from is Bentham's most well-known work and his major treatise in utilitarian philosophy. So we're reading his description of his ethical theory here, and this ends up being foundational for the ethical theory that is subsequently known as utilitarianism, or the tradition of ethical theory known as utilitarianism. So he starts out this text with the following. He says, mankind governed by pain and pleasure. Okay, that's a sentence fragment, but it's just supposed to serve as the heading for this paragraph. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong. On the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. So basically what he's saying here is pleasure and pain are the source both of what human beings actually do, and they're at the source of what human beings ought to do, or what human beings should do. Okay, so they both are the foundation of human behavior, but they're also the foundation of morality, and that we're going to hear more about that very soon. Bentham goes on. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Every effort we make to throw off our subjection to these two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure, will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. In words, a man may pretend to abjure their empire, but in reality he will remain subject to it all the while. The principle of utility recognizes this subjection and assumes it for the foundation of that system, the object of which is to rear the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and of law. Okay, so that's a slightly complicated sentence, but when he says the principle of utility, he's referring to a fundamental principle of his ethical theory, a fundamental belief that is at the core of his ethical theory, which later becomes known as utilitarianism, named after this principle of utility. So we're going to learn more about exactly what that is. Spoiler, it has to do with pain and pleasure. Okay, but we're gonna see more in detail what that is. He says in this sentence that this principle of utility is the foundation of this system, the object of which is to rear the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and law. That means felicity, the word felicity is another way of saying happiness, okay, or well-being, or contentment. And so this system, the utilitarian system, or the system that he's proposing in this book, it has as its object, that is as its aim, what it's trying to bring about, to rear happiness by means of reason and law. Okay, and he takes the principle of utility to be at the foundation of that project. And then finally, he says, systems which attempt to question it, that is the principle of utility, deal in sounds instead of sense, in caprice instead of reason, in darkness instead of light. So he's basically just denigrating or criticizing all other systems that don't adopt the principle of utility as a basic truth about human beings and about morality. And in the next two sections, Bentham tells us more about what this principle of utility is and what he means by the word utility. Okay, so in the second section, he says, by the principle of utility is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever, according to the tendency which it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question, or, what is the same thing in other words, to promote or to oppose that happiness. Basically, what he's saying here is that the principle of utility is the principle that we should approve or disapprove of any action according to the extent to which it augments or diminishes the happiness of some group of people. If I can put it even more simply, we should approve of actions to the extent to which they make a larger number of people more happy, and we should disapprove of actions to the extent to which they make larger amounts of people unhappy, or they cause pain to larger amounts of people. Okay, so that's the basic idea, and we'll learn more about it now by going on to look at section 3. So in section 3, Bentham tells us more about what he means by utility. He says, by utility is meant that property in any object whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness, or what comes again to the same thing, to prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness to the party whose interest is considered. Okay, so an interesting thing that is inserted here in the text, right after this list of things that an action that has utility produces, benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness. Bentham says in this little parenthetical remark that I have underlined here, all this in the present case comes to the same thing. So strangely or surprisingly, Bentham is saying that benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness are all basically the same thing. And likewise, on the other side, when we're talking about preventing bad things, he has this list: mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness. The presumption is that all of those amount to basically the same thing, basically the negative of everything that was listed in the first set. So another way of summarizing what's being said here in section 2 and section 3 is that the principle of utility approves of actions to the extent to which they promote utility, and it disapproves of actions to the extent to which they diminish or fail to promote utility. Okay, and here we can talk about utility as a kind of single quantity that can be either higher or lower and can sometimes be negative. Okay, so when we have positive utility, we have happiness, benefit, advantage, pleasure, good things. When we have negative utility, we have mischief, pain, evil, unhappiness. Okay. Now, Bentham doesn't say this in these two sections, but very soon he starts just talking about positive utility and negative utility in terms of pleasure and pain. And so remember, in the first section he had said mankind is under the governance of two sovereign masters, pleasure and pain. So it turns out that for him, happiness is just pleasure. More pleasure, it means more happiness. And lack of happiness, or you could say unhappiness, is absence of pleasure or even pain, okay? And these can be, again, they can be ranked on a spectrum from higher positive numbers down to 0, and then to negative numbers, and then even lower negative numbers. This might seem a little bit abstract, so I'm going to give you an example very soon. But first I want to clarify a little bit some of what Bentham says about the interest of a party that's considered, okay? Because again, the principle of utility, it favors actions that generate more happiness or more pleasure for some party whose interest is in question, which could be an individual or a group. But very soon we're going to find out that to apply the principle of utility most generally is to apply it to any group of people affected by the action, or the largest group that could be affected by the action, okay? And again, this may seem a little bit abstract. I'm going to come to an example very soon, I promise. But first, I want to just look briefly at what Bentham says about the interests of an individual and the interests of a community.